Hi all, good morning and welcome to my action research proposal presentation. This presentation is titled, Do I Have to Do This in Spanish? Bienvenidos to Spanish Motivation Club. ¿Cómo se dice language teaching tasks? By me, Olivia Tison, through Southern Oregon University. So, to start this study, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my teaching context. I teach at a school called Park Spanish Immersion. It's an elementary school located in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, right outside of Minneapolis. It's a suburb of Minneapolis. I actually teach in the special education department. So I have 10 students with IEPs, which stands for Individual Education Program. 7 of these students are white. 3 are students of color. I have 1 heritage speaker and the others are native English speakers. I have 6 boys and 4 girls. A little bit more about this context. So they do have IEPs, which means that they are pulled out sometimes of their Spanish immersion classrooms to receive minutes for their interventions in math, reading, or behavior in English. So while they spend 60% of their school day in Spanish, their general education peers spend 70% of their school day in Spanish. These students range from 1st grade to 5th grade. So let's talk about the problem a little bit that I've seen, okay? So working in special education, I oftentimes have general education teachers come up to me and tell me, you know, this student of yours just refuses to speak Spanish or isn't trying to speak Spanish. The other problem with this is that a lot of my students do have diagnosed anxiety, ADHD, and or depression that can already create some anxiety just in their normal lives. And so they're already spending a little bit more time outside of the general education classroom than in the slide previous, because sometimes they might need a pep talk or just need a place to calm down. And usually they express that they would prefer that to be in English. If a student would want to calm down using Spanish with special education staff, that would be fine, but usually these students would prefer to have a calming room in English. So these two things have actually caused several students with IEPs to leave the Spanish immersion school for an English school. And sometimes I've wondered to myself as a special education teacher, have we really provided this student with an IEP the least restrictive environment, which is basically the law of special education? And it's made me ask this question is, can we increase students' confidence and motivation toward the L2 so that they can stay in the least restrictive environment, which in this case would be the Spanish immersion school? So let's get into my actual research questions. So given this background knowledge, this has led me to my research question of number 1, what impact does a Spanish club that includes explicit teaching of communication strategies and language teaching tasks have on elementary students with IEP's willingness to communicate in the immersion classroom? Number 2, what impact does a Spanish club with explicit teaching of communication strategies and language teaching tasks have on elementary students with IEP's motivation toward the L2? So I'm going to show you a little bit about the main concepts then of this study. So in the blue, you'll see importance and personal influences on WTC, which stands for willingness to communicate. Number 2 is in orange, the situational influences on willingness to communicate. The 3rd is in green, motivation through tasks. And the 4th is communication strategies. And in the middle, you'll see L2 use. So I'm going to go ahead and expand on this a little bit more through some definitions. So Cal and Philip defined willingness to communicate as being ready to use the L2 in a spoken conversation. Communication strategies defined by Dornier stated that techniques a speaker uses to communicate when presented with difficulties. The 3 communication strategies that I'm going to be explicitly working with are communication and clarification, which is the teaching of como se dice and qué significa eso. The second communication strategy strategy I'll be working on is resourcing, and that's when students might have a word that they need actually in an assignment that's right in front of them, whether that's on the computer or whether that's a piece of paper in front of them, teaching them to go back to that. And the third one is circumlocution, which is describing a word that you might not know how to say in the L2, but you can describe it using words that you do know. The third definition is motivation by Muir and Dornier, stating that it's a reason for a long-term behavior, in this case toward the L2. And lastly, we have language teaching tasks, which I actually first heard about in Professor Julio Torres' class last year, who really opened my eyes to using tasks to motivate students. And it's defined here by Muir and Dornier as tasks where students create something that is meaningful to them. So I'm going to get into the literature review a little bit now, okay? So first, we can talk about the importance and personal influences on willingness to communicate, which is going to include a researcher with the last name of McIntyre quite a bit. So in 1998, he actually said that the purpose of L2 education is to create willingness to communicate. So that underlies the importance of willingness to communicate in the Spanish immersion school. As well as in 2003, he researched the factors of age and gender, and he found that the L2 willingness to communicate was significantly higher in higher grades as opposed to lower grades. This demonstrates for me that lower grades may have less willingness to communicate and therefore less L2 use. And finally here we have Diwali, who in 2018 measured foreign language enjoyment and foreign language classroom anxiety on students from 12 to 18 years old. And he found a significant difference on the effect of more anxiety on low intermediate learners. Those are the personal influences. Let's get into the situational influences. So we have Cal and Philip here, who did a research study on whole class, small group, and dyadic interactions, which basically means partner work. Their results showed that a student's willingness to communicate significantly increased actually in partner work and group work as compared to the whole group classroom context. It also showed that students were more apt to speak with classmates or peers that they considered friends, which you'll see later how that influences my study here for the clubs. And we have Shannon Byfield of 2018, who recommended more opportunities for students to communicate in small groups when working on their L2, and that it's really important to create a classroom environment that is based in patience and listening. Let's go to the next one here, which is motivation through tasks, all right? So as I said before, this was, I was able to learn a lot about this through Professor Julio Torres last year. And we have first here Muir and Dornier. So in 2013, they developed this theory of directed motivational current, and that they expressed the role of cultivating motivation through authentic language teaching tasks. All right. So DMC here suggests that students should have autonomy over tasks to make it authentic, which you'll later see how that plays out in my intervention. Secondly, we have Winnefeld here, who stated that elementary Montessori immersion schools can incorporate language teaching tasks into their elementary school curriculum. And lastly, we have Papi and Abdolazadeh, who defined the difference between the ideal L2 self and the odd to L2 self. There's a lot of research done on that. I encourage you, if you haven't, to look into it. It's really interesting. But basically what this study did is it affirmed the present research in the practice of developing tasks to enhance a student's motivation toward their future L2 self and not ought to L2 self, which you'll see how that plays out also later in my intervention. My last piece of my literature review here is going to be focused on the communication strategies, or CSs. So in 1995, we had Dornier, whose results showed that students had a positive attitude toward using communication strategies and being taught communication strategies, specifically in circumlocution. And we have Lamb of 2018, who researched the effect of teaching communication strategies on both high proficiency and low proficiency English language learners. And it was seen through his study that communication strategies can be taught actually to lower proficiency learners and can be useful to them. Whereas before that wasn't maybe thought of. His research showed that lower proficiency learners can benefit from communication strategies. All right, let's go into my timeline here and then I'll dive in a little bit deeper. All right, so as you can see, we have a control period. We have the intervention. And we have myself taking weekly observation data from teachers and field notes throughout the control period and the intervention, but no pre-observational data. There's a specific form that you'll see later will be taken until after the control period. The pre-Likert survey and the pre-email interviews with parents will go out and be collected after the control period, where then I'll start the intervention. After the intervention, I'll collect the post-observation data from teachers, the post-Likert survey, and the post-email interview with parents. All right, let's get into this. So I have a control period versus the intervention. So during the control period, all students in the school will be prompted to use Spanish, but it's nothing like an intervention. It's nothing specific to this group. No students in the school, as far as I know, are taught communication strategies, so my students will not be learning those. They won't be involved in any language teaching tasks unless it's happening in the general education classroom. And they will have access to normal resource room rewards for specific behavior intervention plans for their IEPs, but not specific to my intervention. So for the intervention, it will actually be including the language teaching task and the communication strategies. Each student will pick a friend to be included in this club with us. So in the club will be me, a student, and one friend. And these clubs will meet 30 minutes once per week. If we're back in the school environment, we'll do that during lunch. And if we're not back in the school environment, we'll do it at like a virtual time outside of their normal teaching hours. They'll have access to rewards during this conversation group, in addition to their normal resource room rewards. Let's go to the intervention. So in the first week, students will choose from 3 different tasks. That's where the autonomy piece comes in that Dornier talked about in Muir. So basically, they'll choose if they want to their task, and I'll give you an example of that in a second, is focused on dogs, a YouTuber, or a trip to Mexico that they're taking with their family. Over the course of these 6 weeks, they'll investigate the task, develop it. They'll have a problem thrown at them. They're going to have to redevelop it, and then they'll present. In terms of communication strategies, the first week will be clarification and confirmation. So I'll be doing como se dice, que significa this. Second week, resourcing. Third week, circumlocution. And the 4th through 6th weeks will be a review of all 3 communication strategies. The rewards will be given to those students who give consent and those who do not give consent to participate in the study. The friend will not be, their friend's data, who's not a student with an IEP, their data will not be included in this study because it is actually not something that is relevant to my research question. So only the students with IEPs, but all the students in the study will receive the reward. There'll be 3 levels of rewards, which I'll show you in a sec. All right, here's an intervention example in this typical day. So I teach them the strategy here, estrategia uno. And then this is one of the choices that they can choose for their task, all right? So this basically says you visited a friend, you were visiting Guatemala with your family, you noticed that there were a bunch of stray dogs on the street, and you wrote a letter to the mayor gave you money, and now you can develop a plan to help solve this problem. So that's an example of the intervention. Here's my data collection. Quantitative data includes pre- and post-observation data from teachers on students L2, pre- and post-Likert surveys, effect size population test to compare the control period to the post-intervention period, and you can see my methods for analyzing that data here. Here's an example from the Likert survey, and here's an example of the observation data from teachers. Here's my qualitative methods, pre- and post-email, field notes, effect size pop. Oh, this should not be here, all right? That should be under qualitative data. Sorry. Here's the parent interview. In conclusion, I'm hoping this will add to existing research on motivation and willingness to communicate in students with IEPs and immersion schools, and I hope task-based learning with communication strategies will create more willingness to communicate and add to existing research. Thank